So, thanks to everyone who's joined us. I guess we can start now, Grace, yes? Thanks to everyone who's joined us. This is the first it's actually the second session, but it's the first real session of Radically Open Recovery. The reason why we've done Radically Open Recovery is because we've been running a series for nearly a year now on open data saves lives. That was our big push at ODI Leeds for 2020. Turned out to be an extremely good call by Paul in December of last year to have open data saves lives as a push for the organisation. And we found that it's been extremely useful to get people to talk about what work they're doing in terms of health data so that other people can hear what they're doing, join in and ask them questions, but also come back to the videos later. So the first thing that I would say on Radically Open Recovery is there is a website. It's at odileeds.org/project/radically open recovery, or just Google Radically Open Recovery ODI Leeds, you'll find it. And all of the stuff that we talk about today, everything will be on there after the fact for you to go back to. The reason why I'm particularly interested in Radically Open Recovery is that I think everybody is thinking about how we build back better, or some similar phrase, after what will be one of the largest recessions that the UK has probably ever had. And there's lots of people talking about these things, and not many people, I think, thinking a lot about them, and certainly not many who are using any data to check whether what they think is at least close to being right. So on this session today, first of all, we're going to have Paul Swinney, who is, Big Cheese. You can tell us what your real job title is, Paul. Big Cheese at Centre for Cities, who can talk about the work that he's doing and that they're doing on understanding what's happening in our economy and what might be a radically open recovery. I'll just say one thing before he starts, because he'll be in charge then. I'm looking at the chat. If you've got any questions, fire them into the chat. My suggestion is, as soon as you think of them, fire them into the chat, and I'll catch up with them after the fact. And you can either ask them yourself or I'll ask them on behalf of you. So I think everybody who wants to be in is in. So we're going to hand over to Paul.
Lovely. Thanks, Tom. I think I'll stick with Big Cheese. I quite like that. Not big smelly cheese, may I add.
Yeah.
Even we're in lockdown, I have kept up my my habits of making sure that I do a blute on a daily basis, which I think is good for the very few people who are in sort of very close proximity to me. Anyway, that's a bit of an aside. Who am I? So Paul Swinney from Centre for Cities. We look at the 63 largest urban areas in the UK. That ranges from Exeter being the smallest, through to places like Barnsley, Wakefield, Cambridge, up to Leeds, Newcastle, and then London obviously being the largest of all of those places. And we're trying to understand, what is the contribution that these places make to the national economy, or not, as the case may be, and what does that then mean from a policy perspective? Now, it's great to be talking here today on this session. So very much having the data focus, because everything, or pretty much everything we do, starts from what is the data? Is the data there available to be able to tell a story, to understand or better understand the world, to actually sort of tell the stories and the understanding that Tom alluded to at the very start. But we don't often get to sort of do discussions which is about the data specifically, despite it being, really, really important, what data is available. Because if it's not available, it's hard to understand what's going on, and it just makes, our lives more difficult, but actually policy much more difficult as well. But what's really, I think, well, we're obviously living in terrible times. I think that goes without saying. But from a data perspective, actually it's quite an exciting time, in that it feels that it's the first recession where actually real-time data and big data is starting to come in and tell us things. We're able to find out what was happening 3 days ago. Whereas if you work with local data, you'll know that actually usually the data you're working with is at least 2 years out of date before it even gets published, which is just incredibly frustrating. So when you then go into a recession, and so I remember back to the last one when I just started at Centre for Cities, you can't really tell what's going on beyond claim and count data. Whereas actually today we've got so much data that's coming to the fore now that we feel like we can tell a story about what's going on across the country, which is great from a in terms of trying to sort of inform policy and trying to improve policy. Of course, none of that will be used for the spending review today, but I'll rant about that towards the end of this presentation. So let's focus on the positives first. What data have we been using that's been new, that's allowed us to tell some quite interesting stories? Well, the first one is our COVID tracker. Now, we're not the only people to do that. I don't think this is particularly groundbreaking. I think what we have done, though, that is a little bit different, is we've used it on the geographies that we look at, so those 63 largest areas. So for some places like Wakefield, it'll just be Wakefield Local Authority, but for somewhere like Manchester, it's Manchester Local Authority and the 7 authorities that are around it. We count Wigan as separate, as you can see in this list. So it's looking at the build-up area of a place. And so looking at that, that's quite interesting in terms of the area that people tend to live and work their lives over, what's going on from a COVID perspective. And it sort of pains me very much to say that this is the top selection of cities. There's 11 there, or 12 there maybe, and looking down, all of them in the north, with the exception of Leicester, which is in the, well, Leicester and Stoke, which sort of fall within the Midlands, which is obviously very sad to see. And you can see the changes of you can see not only there the overall number of cases, but actually we put this little chart in as well to show what the direction looks like as well, which is interesting to see, and it sort of brings a little bit more of that granularity to a lot of the headline figures that get presented. And it's interesting even when you see the government sort of presenting their figures in some of the daily briefings, they'll only ever really tell you about regions. I understand why they're doing that, because if you go down to too granular level, it just gets too confusing. But actually, you know, regions don't make sense from an economic perspective and don't really make sense from a COVID perspective. You know, trying to understand sort of what's going on much more locally is important for you about the area that you sort of live and work your life over. The second one, which I think is much more novel and is much more exciting, is the High Streets Recovery Tracker that we've been doing. So this is freely available on our website for all 63 cities. You can go in, you can play around with it and play with lots of different metrics. I'll run you through some metrics that we've got for Leeds, which I'm guessing is most interesting for people on the call. Excellent thumbs up, Tom. And so how we do this is we use anonymized mobile phone data to look at how people are moving around. And then we do some categorizations of those people as well to try and get a bit more of an insight about who is moving around, going into city centres or not, the case may be, and what does that then mean from a policy perspective. So what we've got here is the overall tracker, the total number of people going into the centre of Leeds, indexed back to February 2020 levels. Unsurprisingly, you can see there was a massive drop as lockdown came in. It's been pretty flat through until non-essential shops opened in the 15th of June, and then there's been a bit of a creep up. That creep up hasn't been that great, and actually it's been pretty flat, certainly from the middle of July onwards, that we just haven't seen people going back to Leeds city centre in the way that we have in some smaller city centres. So London and large cities haven't seen this return back to city centre activity. Medium and small size cities have actually seen a much bigger bounce back. The other thing we've got wrapped up within this is, which is what the bars represent, is spend data as well. Now, this is using credit card and debit card data, which is also really, really interesting that we're using that. It poses a bit of a challenge in that, particularly during COVID, if we're seeing a move away from cash towards cards, then that is going to skew the data a little bit. But despite sort of the caveats, and I think a lot of big or real-time data comes with a lot of caveats, despite the caveats, I think there's a lot of interesting things we can get from the data that we just have to sort of treat with kid gloves a little bit, but make sure that we don't sort of say, well, we couldn't possibly use it because, oh, there's these potential issues with it. It's more about we recognize the issues, what stories can we still extract from that to try and give us a better understanding of what's going on. So that's really, really fascinating. You can see here in terms of the overall index from a footfall perspective, what this means 45 is that there's about 45% of the number of people in the centre of Leeds towards the end of October, I think is when we last updated this data, compared to what it was pre-lockdown. Now, if you're a cafe or a bar or a shop in the centre of Leeds and you've actually seen a 55% fall in the customer walking past your front door, clearly that is bad news. Now, one of the reasons for that is this. And so again, what we're able to do with the data, and it's not perfect, and we'll probably have to rebase it at some point, but what we're able to do is to identify workers in the city centre. So we're doing that by saying, well, if somebody is going into the city centre for X number of hours, for X number of days a week, the chances are that they are a worker. So we can identify them in our data set. And what you can see here is actually, while there was some recovery in terms of footfall overall, in terms of workers, it's been pretty flat. It fell off a cliff, unsurprisingly, when lockdown came in, and then there hasn't really been any change since. Now, given that the success of Leeds city centre is from a high street perspective is primarily because there are tens of thousands of people come into office jobs every day. They go out for lunch, they go out after work, they might even skive in the afternoon. That's casting no aspersions on people who live in Leeds, but I'm sure there'll be one or two people who may well do it. That's great news for the high street, and so they've then, Leeds city centre has been very vibrant over the last few years, despite sort of the death of the high street you hear about, because of this massive worker army which comes and spends money. They're not coming to do that anymore because they're working from home, and that's a big issue in terms of the performance of the city centre. And then finally, in terms of this data, what we're also able to do is to cut it by certain times of the day. So what we then do is look at a nighttime index as well to understand what's going on with the evening economy. And what you can see there, again, massive fall off. When Super Saturday happened, 4th of July, bit of an uptick, but it's much lower than what it was in the pre-times. And being someone who had part of my stag do out in Leeds city centre, I know what a fantastic night out it is. So it's very sad to see that that's the current circumstances, perhaps unsurprisingly. But it's interesting to get the data behind that to understand quantitatively what that looks like. And then the final sort of interesting big data thing that we've used, and we've just put this out, is to take spend data again, so credit and debit card data, but now we're looking at it not from the perspective of how much money is spent within city centres, but instead saying, right, all urban residents, how much are they spending? And the interesting, why this is particularly interesting is to look at the shift in the share of money that's gone online, or shift in the share of spend that's gone online. Now, there were calls of or as lockdown came in, to say, COVID is going to accelerate the death of the high street. People are going to be forced to go online and they're not going to come back again. So we thought, okay, well, let's have a look at that. And so we got the data up until the end of September to see, well, what is that spread of online v offline spend? So the light green bars are the share of spend that was done online in February. And Cambridge is the online shopping capital of all cities in the UK. Followed by London, Crawley and Brighton. And at the other end of the scale, Burnley spent the least online. It's quite interesting. Then when you look in terms of the increase, first thing to note is actually the increase hasn't actually been as big as perhaps what people might have expected. It's somewhere in the range of sort of 3 to 6 percentage points. Cities in Wales, I think, have seen the largest increase, but that's partly because I think, sort of much more uncertainty around, I think, rules and etc. And sort of the early increase in COVID in September in particular probably is sustained a bit more online spend than what we have seen in England and Scotland. But that shift hasn't been that great. And actually, interestingly, Cambridge still remains top of the list. London still remains second top, and Burnley still remains at the bottom. Bit of a shift in between, but actually there hasn't been as much of a shift as what you might expect. I mean, if we were to stand here and say, there's been a shift of 10 percentage points online or 15 percentage points online, that might well not have surprised people. But actually the fact that it's only sort of between 3 and 6 percentage points, for me at least, actually was quite surprising and actually quite heartening that there hadn't been perhaps as big a shift to online as maybe what would be expected. And there's loads more that we're going to pull out from this data as well over the coming weeks to sort of investigate and say, well, how is spending change across cities in terms of absolute levels, as well as in terms of the makeup, and what does all of that mean? And I haven't put a title on this slide. What we can also do with this is to say, well, actually, what's going on in terms of online spend v offline spend relative to where it was in March. And you can see here, Hull and London. In Hull, online spending is 29% higher than what it was pre-lockdown. In London, it's 22% higher. But then what's been going on in terms of offline spend? Well, interestingly, despite online spend being much higher in Hull than what it was back in February, March time, offline spend, so spend in bricks and mortar, actually is almost recovered, or in September anyway, before more restrictions came in, it almost got back to where it was in February levels. So despite sort of the highest spend here, actually people were spending as much, pretty much in bricks and mortar. Now again, that might be skewed a little bit because people are using less cash and using more card, and we've got to be wary of that. But it's interesting to see that's the pattern, particularly when it's then compared to London, where online spend was up 22%, but actually offline spend, bricks and mortar spend, was only 78% of where it was pre-lockdown. So actually some of those bars, cafes, restaurants, retailers across the whole of London look like they're struggling more than what they are for those in Hull. Now, that's all the exciting stuff. Final slide is where hopefully I've got a tiny bit of time to have a little bit of a rant. So what we see is that we've had lots of private sector data sources come forward and produce data. I haven't presented anything on the Google stuff today, although we're looking at that currently. Apple have been doing things. There are all sorts of TomTom are doing it, InRix are doing it to traffic providers. You know, it's just fantastic. All this stuff is coming forward. And then we move to the public sector. Now, the public sector has sat on big data for decades, if not centuries. And HMRC sits on perhaps one of the most valuable data sets in all of UK, certainly UK economics anyway, and it collects all this data by a byproduct because it takes taxes from us all, and yet it doesn't use it. And I just find this absolutely gobsmacking, that if you were to actually sort of utilise the power of all that data that HMRC holds, then you could sort of tell, or you find out so much about how not only the UK economy operates, but actually how different parts of the UK operate as well. And that's important in terms of normal times, but actually it's even more important in terms of a recession. So what the Chancellor stood up, and I don't even know what sort of fiscal event this is since March with the number, but it is, what is it, the third at least? And he's going to say a load of things, but actually it's not going to be based on a lot of the insights that HMRC data could potentially give us, because HMRC doesn't crunch it out. So what it has done is it has released data on the job retention scheme. It didn't do it at the local level at first. It then started to do it, but it only said, here the total number of people who've actually claimed GRS at any point during the scheme. And then I think about a month ago, they said, well, maybe that's not that helpful. Actually, I tell you what, we'll tell you how many people were claiming at the end of August, as well as how many people have claimed in total. They released some more data this morning, and it hasn't got any better in terms of the quality of data they've released. So I'll tell you a little bit about what the chart says. The hollowed out bars tell you how many people claim GRS at any point, or on furlough at any point within a city. The green bar is the number of people who were claiming by the end of August. Interesting things here are, if you look at a place like Middlesbrough, Middlesbrough actually hasn't had very many people claiming GRS at any point relative to other places, which is a bit of a surprise. And it had some of the lowest levels of claimants at the end of August. And I think that's maintained in the September data as well, which has just been released, which is very interesting. And a place like Sunderland, because I can't go through any presentation without shoehorning Sunderland in somehow, Sunderland had a huge share of people claiming furlough at some point over the last 6 or 7 months, but actually that's come right down. So very reliant on the scheme in the short term, but actually moved off it quite quickly. Whereas if you then go at the other end and look at a place like Crawley or London, very large numbers of people who have claimed, and that rate has been very stubborn in terms of coming down as well, which is interesting. But that doesn't really tell you a great deal beyond the headlines. Really, what we want to know is what sectors have been affected at the local level. You know, is it shops and restaurants, which when people come back to city centres to work, for example, we think that actually those types of businesses will thrive again because demand will return? Or actually, is it sort of the prosperity engines of their economy? Is it their ICT sector? Is it their aviation sector that's been affected? You know, these types of initiatives that bring money into the economy. And it's really important to understand that, because that then tells you about, are we going to see a V-shaped recovery in some places, or a U-shape, or no recovery whatsoever? We have the data in principle, we own that as taxpayers, and yet it isn't made available. So I'm going to stop ranting about that, because I'm sure we can get into question and answers about it, but it's a thing that really irritates me more than anything else at the moment, because it's just so frustrating that we're so close to it. But I shall stop there. Thanks, Tom.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Paul. I can see that Sarah has joined us, which is great news for me, but we'll take some questions first. There's already some good ones. I think you've had a little bit of a rant already about it, but I like Henry's. And specific. So Henry asks, how slow to the party are the ONS and government departments? And I think I'd add a third one into that, which is the Bank of England. I think there needs to be questions about that. What's your feeling on those 3 places, how well they're doing? So that's ONS, government departments, and Bank of England. Yeah.
So the best of a bad bunch, I think, is ONS. In fairness, I think they have been doing, they have been experimenting quite a lot during this period. I think they were going down the right track probably in the 2 or 3 years before the recession as well. There have been changes within ONS to push things forward. It's slow, but I think, you know, the progress is in the right direction. But still, we're not seeing sort of lots of great stuff at the local level being produced, which I think is partly reflective of the fact that, you know, trying to sort of go from your surveys and then expand those surveys is difficult. And actually, a lot of the stuff that was an issue with surveys, full stop, which, you know, you sort of rant about in itself, but actually means that some of the traditional stuff that ONS collects has been affected because people aren't filling the surveys in now. But there have been sort of experiment with some big data, I know, which I haven't seen many results of as yet, but they are pushing in the right direction. The bank seems to have dabbled a little bit, but, you know, to no great extent. And I completely agree with you, Tom. You know, again, why are they not? They've got a fantastic data team there who are not just sort of, you know, people who put stats together, but actually a data analyst. So you think would be asking these questions. I think the big problem with the bank is that they have very much a macroeconomic outlook and think the UK economy is flat, when clearly that is not the case. Now, part of that's to do with the way economics is taught in universities, but you'll get me on my other hobby horse if I start going down that route. And then we move to HMRC, which they're just statisticians who, or they've got some statisticians there who I just don't think understand the value of the thing that they sit on. I think they're being pushed to produce the GRS stats, which they're not. I always get the impression they've sort of dragged their feet about. And then we've complained to loads of different people who we hope who can put a bit of pressure on without any avail in terms of actually them sort of producing better local stats. And the response we've officially got from HMRC is effectively, this is not a priority for us. You might get it at some point in the future, which is, it's just scandalous. If you think about how this recession is playing out up and down the country and or how you could better inform policy and save quite a lot of money if you would actually use some of this data they sit on already. I just, yeah. I'll finish there on that question. Great question.
So Paul has come in basically to troll me with a question which is about how other countries compare to the UK. Obviously, you and I have both looked at some of the French data, which is the administrative side data, and it's really quite impressive. And I've been told many times that I need to stop being unpatriotic and accept that the UK's data is better. I've actually had that exact phrase used to me, but it is quite interesting. I don't know if it feeds into policy there. You can have all the data in the world. I'm not sure the French economy minister cares any more than ours, but it certainly does. Have you looked at any other countries beyond those two for looking at how they're using data to understand the economy and respond to it?
We haven't actually. That's a really good point. I mean, I know about the French stuff because of you tweeting about it, Tom, and I just saw it and we just was sort of made it even more depressed when seeing it. But we haven't sort of looked into what's going on elsewhere. I think we have seen some of the private providers doing things. And I think we look on in envy at the data that the US crunches out as a matter of course around the economy. You can get jobs down to what it seems like sort of individual blocks within cities, never mind just here's some data for a local authority, which is a bit crap. It's like, no, it'll tell you sort of very specific stuff. But I mean, when I saw the French data, I couldn't believe the granularity that it was being presented at. But I guess maybe I've just been conditioned to thinking that actually we're not going to get data at very low levels, and the French have shown that we can, and maybe we should be much more demanding. And I think that someone turns out to you, Tom, and says that you should be more patriotic. I mean, that's absurd. We should be using the French example to say, this is what's possible. You know, why have we not got this here to be able to have the sort of insights that we need to have? Now, you do make an important point about however, which I haven't said, is that it's not just about the provision of data, which is important. You've got to also, I think, have the desire to use it, but also probably a framework to understand that data too. And so a good example, which myself and Tom were talking about just before the start, and he was discussing on Twitter recently, is data on housing. And you know, you can get data on housing which says, oh look, you know, there's an algorithm that says we're going to build more houses in the south than in the north. And you say that's not fair, we should be building equal amounts. Well, actually, if you then look at other data around how expensive housing is in the south relative to the north, it would suggest that we probably do need more houses in the south and we need to do something else for the north. So having that understanding of, I think, not only just the data itself, but the context is also very important too. So that's the tricky thing with real-time data, is it sort of create an explosion of data but actually the data itself doesn't tell you everything on its own. You've got to understand the context that it sits within.
Right, fantastic. So I take the organizer's prerogative. I'll get the last question, and then we'll switch over to Sarah. But what I wanted to ask about was the source on all of your charts is Beauclair, I think I wrote down.
Yes.
For a year or so, we've worked with Network Rail, and our great achievement with Network Rail is that we got them to release the number of people who use Leeds train station every 30 minutes. You've got financial data for the whole country, every place, very quickly. It's more of a kind of broader question, but I also should say, Indeed, the job advertising company, have released all their data for the whole world for everyone to use. It's quite a different approach. How was your experience of working with Beauclair, asking them, like, did they come to you? Did you come to them? How did you figure out that they were going to be willing to give you that data?
Yeah, so there's two main sources on those charts. One is Beauclair, which is the credit card and debit card data, and then Locomizer is the company that's got the anonymous mobile phone data to give you footfall. So Locomizer was a pre-existing relationship. It was actually the person who runs Locomizer actually was working in the lab that my wife did her PhD in. And he sort of moved away from science to do this sort of thing, and we've been having chats for quite some time, and we've done a little bit of work with them already. So then when it came to sort of the current sort of recession, it was like, actually, let's have a conversation about how your data might be able to help us out. We think we could do something really interesting with it now. With Beauclair, I think Rob, who runs Beauclair, he'd approached us, or we'd seen something that they'd done elsewhere. And so then we started having a conversation to say, well, what can your data do? Which way can we cut it? What geographies can we get it to? And both providers have been excellent in terms of understanding, I think, the requirements of what we need, but also being able to turn the data around very quickly too, which, relative to the conversations that you were having with Network Rail, Tom, it's night and day in terms of how quickly this stuff can then be used. In part, I think it's because you're dealing with people who are in a specialism, which is understanding data and understand the value of producing it. Whereas the challenge we have with a lot of public sector organisations is that the data stuff is not their day job. It's like a little bit tacked on the end, or they've got one small team which is an afterthought as to funding it. And I think there needs to be a shift in that the public sector needs to understand the value of the massive asset that they sit on, which is data. We get very excited about assets in terms of buildings, etc. And yet all this data sits there and it's just so underused, and there needs to be a shift in that. And I think there's a lot to learn from private sector companies like Locomizer and Beauclair. And indeed.
Well, in that on that note, you can come back anytime, Paul. That's you're very welcome if you're going to be talking about valuing data. But obviously, we completely agree here, and we think it's been really interesting for me to see in a terrible time how quickly some places have been able to innovate. Obviously, in Leeds, we're tracking footfall by the bin use, and we just never would have thought to use it. But every day we get live data on how much waste gets put in bins. You're there, so we know exactly. And I'm going to check after this if it correlates with the spending data. It looks like it does, right? It looks perfect to me, but we'll see. So thanks very much, Paul. Next, I believe, because I have seen her name in the chat, that Sarah Longlands is here from IPPR North.
Hi, yes, Tom, I am.
Oh, brilliant. We go live to somewhere near Bolton now, right?
Yeah, that's right, from heart of Longlands in Bolton.
Right, yeah.
Really great to be joining you this morning, and nice to see everybody, even if it's only through the power of Zoom. And apologies for joining late.
No problem at all. So just for people who don't know, Sarah Longlands, yeah, sure. I introduced Paul as the big cheese. You are also the big cheese. I mean, we all get to make up we're sufficiently senior that we get to make up our job titles. So you can give your official one, but Sarah's in charge of IPPR North. You can talk about whatever you want to. In advance, we are going to ask you one question about insulating homes, because it's something that we're very interested in at ODI Leeds. We want to figure out what you're doing. Additionally, I'm quite interested in it, since of all the possible things we could spend money on that might create jobs, insulating homes seems like pretty much the most obviously not bad one. I can't see anything wrong with it, but maybe someone in the chat will tell us that actually we shouldn't insulate homes. I don't know, it could happen. So I will hand over to you to tell us about what IPPR North are doing and what the thinking is at the moment about how we can build a stronger recovery, ideally using some data, which all the IPPR North stuff does anyway.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know how much people know about IPPR North. IPPR is one of the few think tanks that's actually based outside of the Westminster bubble. And IPPR North was set up about 16 years ago, really to try and kind of move the conversation about policy into areas, into regions like the North, and to kind of provide a forum to get some of those ideas and challenges and discussions happening in other parts of the country. We've done lots of work over the years using data, a lot on regional investment, a lot on devolution, and I think data is really important to us, particularly quant data, in trying to understand the context in which we're working, but also kind of the future of direction, the future of policy direction as well. So I just thought this morning I'd just give you some sort of general thoughts from us as to kind of where we are at the moment, and then just some examples of where we've been using data recently, including some of the upcoming work that we've got, just to kind of give you a sense of how important it is for us. And then I'll also reflect on the kind of levelling up agenda, because that's kind of pretty important for us at the minute. So I'll just share my screen. Bear with me a minute. So hopefully you should be seeing that now. Is that coming through okay?
It is.
Yeah, okay, great. Let me just go from the beginning. So yeah, that's it's just me. So yeah, for me, there's kind of three ways of trying to understand where we are at the minute, which kind of come into my mind when I think about this stuff. And first of all, it's about the kind of the cracks and the chasms, that if there were cracks or weaknesses in our economy or our places before this crisis, then this crisis is really kind of blowing them apart. And they've turned much more, they've turned into chasms really going forward. And I think we've seen that in parts of our high streets. We've also seen it in some of our businesses and some of the ways in which we're working. And I think for us, the challenge is trying to use data to understand just exactly what those trends are, and kind of what impacts are that the crisis is having, as well as opportunities to explore where places have been particularly resilient, or where particular aspects of our economy have been more resilient than others, which businesses are doing well and which parts of the economy will weather the storm in a way that perhaps we didn't expect, and how perhaps it's driven innovation as well as negative impacts. So that's the first thing. The second thing is about shifting sands. And I think for us, if we're talking about recovery, then I think it's really important. And I mean, I guess it will make sense to most of us on this call, but I think it's really important for us to keep making the point, particularly to central government, that the point at which we begin the recovery will be very different depending on where you are in the country, and particularly you've got the added complication of the tier system on top of that. So I think there's a point about shifting sand for us, and really kind of driving home again and again the importance of the regional inequality debate, because I don't think that really sinks through. And I think it's come up already in the discussion, you know, Paul's point about the fact that it can be much more difficult to get the data at a local or regional basis, because in fact the way in which our data operates is fairly centralized as well. So I think that's a key point for us. And I want to just explore some of those inequalities and how we're trying to use data to understand the scale of those inequalities before the crisis, and then how we start to anticipate the impact that COVID might have. And then thirdly, for me, it's about the kind of permanence of change, because obviously COVID is driving massive changes across our society and across our economy. But there's a point for me about, you know, the degree to which those are permanent or temporary. You know, like there's been a lot of fuss recently about, you know, the death of cities and the fact that, you know, places people are going to work from home from now on, and so on and so forth. And I think those are probably a little bit exaggerated. I think trying to understand how data can help us answer those questions both now and in the future, I think is going to be really important. So that's kind of how we're trying to understand the situation at the minute, and trying to kind of conceptualize how we can use data and how we can, what new questions are emerging from this crisis that we need to get to grips with. So I'm just going to talk through a few examples, and I want to focus particularly on the Levelling Up Challenge, because for me that's really about the shifting sands. You know, the government have made a big play on this levelling up stuff without a lot of detail about what they actually mean by it or how they define it, or even what their strategy will be to address it. We might get a little bit more information today from the Comprehensive Spending Review. So we'll see, but I thought it was important just to sort of think about what the kind of what bases we're starting from. So we did quite a lot of analysis earlier this year looking at local government expenditure, and looking at data which told us what the change had been in local revenue service expenditure by local authorities per head between 2018 up until 2018, and you can start to see the difference between 2009 and 2019, and you can start to see the regional variation in that. And indeed, you know, council spending, this analysis showed us, and we published it in June, the analysis showed us that across England there was a reduction in council spending by around 13%, but in the north of England it was actually about 20%. And that equates to, in the north, about £346 per person, and which is, you know, a pretty kind of marked change. So that's money coming out of the local economies and impacting on the service provision for people in local authorities across the England and across the north particularly. So kind of real disparity, and that removal of expenditure, that removal of employment, has had I think a disproportionate impact on the ability to respond to crises like austerity. So we've used data to try and understand kind of the capacity at a local level and how that perhaps has had an impact on the resilience of services to react at a time of COVID, or at least at the very least to ask questions about it, and to argue that if we're going to see future austerity, well, this is the consequences of it, and that the impact is disproportionate depending on where you are in the country. The next tape graph comes from the same publication actually, where we looked at homelessness, and this looks at sort of temporary accommodation. So we looked at some of the data on temporary accommodation again from local authorities, and explored the sort of percentage change, and quite a stark graph in terms of the, you know, how parts of the country have seen massive changes in the increase in number of households in temporary accommodation, which again tells you something about the way in which our economy shifted over the last 10 years, and again about that link back to local authority capacity. We've done another piece of work, which is the publication on the right hand side. We published that just a couple of months ago, or actually just last month, and that looked at another particular aspect of the homelessness debate, really, which was about what we call transitional supported housing. And I haven't got any data for you on this, because that's one of the real issues in this, that there is no data about what we call transitional supported housing. So if for transitional supported housing basically refers to the supply of housing to people who are homeless, or who are fleeing domestic abuse, or are refugee and migrant, people who need support in their home to be able to overcome challenges in their own life. And that might be a domestic situation, it might be addiction, or it might be homelessness, but they need that extra support as well as a roof over their head. And literally, when we started to look at this project, the government don't collect any data about this. So we know from a bit of data collection that was done back in 2016, roughly, that there's about 200,000 people who need this accommodation, but that's really out of date. And we know that in this crisis, there's going to be a massive increase in the number of people who need and require supported transitional supported housing. But yeah, we don't have the tools to be able to deal with it. So I think you know, we know there's a crisis in homelessness and demand on services. Anyway, even before COVID, we know that COVID will play into that. But yet, when it comes to trying to predict what supported housing will be required, there's a real failure there of the data to deliver the answers that we need. So you're basically just kind of stumbling around in the dark. So our report is less about data, more about saying, look, the data that we have is inadequate, and we need now urgent action to put in place some sort of rigorous and systematic collection of data in the future. The third graph I wanted to look at was about health. Now, this actually hasn't been published yet. We're going to be publishing this in a couple of weeks. But this looks at health, and we've used in this report. There's a huge amount of data analysis that we've done looking at the sort of levelling up challenge when it comes to health, and we look particularly at the regional variation in this. And I mean, this is just an example. I mean, a lot of the data in this report are quite kind of eye-watering, but again, it just brings home the fact that when we're talking about COVID and we're talking about recovery, we're not all starting from the same place. That the regional inequalities in the UK are amongst the worst in Western Europe, and we need policy needs to start recognising that in a much more explicit way. So I mean, just look at this graph here. This shows the variation in mortality rates for people aged under 75 across the English region. So it's a variation within regions, and you can see if you look at the Northwest, that even the lowest mortality rates are still higher than in parts of London than the Southeast. And it's a really even, you know, in terms of some of the areas that are best off in parts of the Northwest, and indeed the West Midlands comes out pretty poorly in this as well. And I think in terms of health, when we're talking about COVID particularly, this crisis has really kind of brought home the very close relationship between health and our economy. And what we're arguing for in this report in a few weeks' time is that we have to start seeing how, you know, that the good health of our population is a kind of core component of a good economy, and that data can start to illuminate that. So I mean, we talk about this kind of, you know, the regional divide in the UK, and we tend to talk about the economic divide and the health and social divide in separate boxes. But actually, when you start to see figures like this, you start to understand why levels of productivity are much lower in parts of the north than they are in other parts of the UK. It's not that people in the north are lazier or less innovative or less entrepreneurial, but simply that rates of things like health and wider determinants of health, like housing and good quality environments, lag significantly behind other parts of the UK. That's not to say that there aren't issues of poor health and deprivation in other parts of the country, but yeah, we seem to have much higher concentrations in the north. And then finally, we've also started to, as you mentioned about the kind of insulating homes point, we just published a bit of a report a couple of weeks ago looking at kind of, you know, economic recovery and potentially sort of direct jobs, and that could be, you know, what are the potential for sort of jobs in GVA as a result of a kind of a green stimulus. So we've started to explore that in a bit more detail. There's a lot more work needs to be done on this. And this was kind of us sort of dipping our toe in the water, building on some work that our colleagues did in London and trying to think, well, what could this mean for a region like the North? But I think, as Tom was saying at the start, I think this is an area which really requires urgent attention. And I think for the North, we have a really strong natural environment in many ways. We've got, when it comes to our natural resource, we've got some of the best kind of the highest levels of natural assets in the UK. We've got the majority of England's peatland and upland. We've got a huge percentage of kind of water bodies. We've got 5 of them, 10 national parks. So it's in our interest really to build on those riches when it comes to kind of future recovery. And this report starts trying to kind of delve into that a little bit. So yeah, so that's kind of just kind of give you a sort of flavour of how we're trying to use data. Just to kind of sort of some final thoughts from me. I mean, I think it's pretty clear, and we all agree on this, that we really need data. That, you know, there's the good qualitative and quantitative data is absolutely crucial to understand the impact of the crises. But as Paul was saying, there are regional and local data caps which are really serious. And I mentioned about the gaps in terms of transitional support to housing, but also in terms of things like energy efficiency. We know that when it comes to energy performance certificate, we've only got data for about 40% of homes in the north. And one of the things that we recommend in our report is that if you're going to invest in retrofit or green heat pumps or whatever it is, then you need to have a much better understanding of what the housing stock is in the north. And at the minute, local authorities, housing associations do collect this data, but they all do it differently. They all use different methodologies, and there's a real lack of pulling that together. And I know that that's something that ODI have been looking at as well. So that's I think one of the big challenges of the regional local data gap is that as I think Paul and Tom both have mentioned, the aggregate data masks a huge amount of local and regional variation. And I don't think that's taken seriously enough by ONS and other kind of data providers in the market. But I think the other thing to say is that data isn't enough. It's not a passive reflection of external reality, and it's not value neutral. So if you look at how data, the government are proposing to use data in, for example, the planning decisions, actually that could be an abuse of data, and it could actually help. It could be give data a bad name in terms of eroding the sort of democratic accountability within those decisions. Although you might argue that democracy and planning is a very strained relationship anyway, so it doesn't matter. So, but it's an interesting one, I think, in terms of how they're proposing that the data should be used. I think as well, inevitably, stuff like levelling up, is political, and data will only get us so far. And the stuff today we'll hear about the Green Book is a little bit of a red herring, I feel, because stuff like Green Book's always been about politics and capacity, and the data's almost been about constructing the arguments rather than generating the arguments. And I think the other thing for me is about the centralisation point, that data is really powerful, but power often decides what data will be taken most seriously. And centralised government impacts on data availability. We were just talking about HMRC, highly centralised. And so I think in terms of devolution, decentralisation going forward, data needs to be a key priority in that conversation as well. So it's not just kind of how we use the data, but where the data is generated from. And I think that's a thing that perhaps has been overlooked so far in some of the conversations about devolution. But anyway, it's just some sort of random thoughts there at the end from me, but hope that's useful.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's brilliant. I've noticed that Kate Simpson has asked some good questions. So if Kate, you'd like to ask a question of Sarah, I'll give you a minute to think of one. We'll not put you on the spot whilst I grab the first one. I just want to say that the point you make about the EPC data and its coverage, obviously you found the same doing this recent report. We've kind of refound the same recently. It's such an important point. You can't predict how many jobs you're going to create retrofitting homes if you have no idea whether they have double glazing or not.
Yeah.
It's not massively difficult. So it's a good one. I thought as well certainly on homelessness, one of the bits of data that continually astonishes me is when local authorities do their counts of homelessness, the kind of headline figure is often the on-street homelessness, and you get numbers which every one of us does not believe is what we experience. It is true, let's be clear, it's the councils go around and count people who are sleeping on the street on a given night, but we know that there are more than 42 people in Leeds who are homeless, but that's the headline figure. So there's definitely something about the data needs to measure the right thing, but also... There was
an interesting report a few years ago. Did you see the report from Just Life? I think it was not last year, but the year before, and it looked at the kind of hidden homelessness, because it was saying that you basically be counting everybody who's in a hostel and stuff as well, but that data is not published in a routine basis. So yeah,
there's definitely a huge opportunity to improve things. Do you want to jump in, Kate? Do you have anything specific, or if not, you don't need to?
Yeah, no, I do have a question. Thanks, Tom.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I had a few thoughts going through that actually, but one thing, so my own research, I look at retrofit and use of data in decision making, and one challenge that I found is that we just don't have much data out there, partly because of the personal nature of homes. I'm looking at post-occupancy evaluation side, but we don't have much data on what's been installed and where the products have come from. There's so much data that could make the retrofit process much safer, easier, more reliable, that we could use that going forward to learn what works and what doesn't. So I guess my question is to everybody really, ODI and IPPR, do you know of any local initiatives to collect that data on a local level? that could incorporate like the installers in the area and the materials that are being deployed and the impacts and the retrofits carried out? Or do you know of any initiatives where that's been discussed as a way forward? Because I don't think that's happening anywhere in the UK yet. I think there's a few ideas around like Trustmark and the installers, and I think there's some other ideas around like EPC data and operational data. And there's also ideas around like, should it be, you know, completely open? Should it be in a cooperative? So yeah, it's not a very clear-cut question.
I think it's good though. It's
Yeah.
a big topic.
Talk about. Yeah, it is a big topic, and it's not an easy. I don't think there's an easy solution when it's such personal data as well. So yeah, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts in relation to that. And thanks, really interesting talk from both you and Paul.
I mean, if I just
thanks,
dive in
Kate.
quickly on that. I mean, I think we were really kind of frustrated doing that project because we were really, I think, you know, just shocked at the lack of data that was actually available. But also, I think the data on costs of retrofit vary hugely. And so one of the things that we did quite a lot in our work was just started talking to people, particularly housing associations, about what they were spending on retrofit. And I think the housing associations and social housing providers do have a lot of data themselves. But it's how do you start to pull them together in a way which is you know, in a kind of more systematic way, I guess, and then perhaps using that as a bit of a proxy. But yeah, and that's more or less what we did in our work, really, with the cost data. Just trying to ask a sort of as wider a sample as possible and then using that as a bit of a proxy. But yeah,
it's like a good way to go on the cost. I also tried to find cost data and I spoke to some suppliers and they said, well, it depends who the client is and how much they buy it. So it's really variable. There isn't
and I mean, I think I'm happy to put you, I'm happy to kind of have, you know, carry the conversation on after this, Kate, if that would be useful, and, you know, sort of compare notes on how we could perhaps do it.
Yeah,
well,
that could be really helpful. Thank you, Sarah.
There's going to be a clip of you, Sarah, for the 10 seconds where you talk about why we need better EPC data on the web, and then everybody will be linking to it and trying to get better data on it, because I think everyone agrees that it's. I mean, we've recently been looking at other nations of the UK, and I'm not particularly impressed by England's EPC data, but any Scots on the call, I'm coming for you, because you don't even release it.
There's a consultation out at the moment on the future of SAT, the standard
Ooh.
assessment procedure that's used to get that data. So I'll see if I can find a link and pop it in the chat.
Yes, please do. Yes, this is great. We might pick your brain separately, Kate, on another occasion, because we'd love to know more about how, basically saying, how do we improve these EPCs? Because it was a brilliant thing that kind of came from nowhere. And then it seemed to be abandoned by government a little bit, just as it got good. Like, why have you done this? What a waste of time. And I think my other fear about all data in housing, having worked with a lot of data in housing all the time, is there are areas where we have really good data that is completely fabricated. I think we need to be aware of that, specifically and grimly on fire safety, for example. We know it's not true, right? We know there's been great investigations on that. So I think there's probably something to do around making sure that this stuff's trustworthy as well. Okay, anybody else before we wrap it up? Because I always like to finish a 1 hour meeting with at least 2 minutes before. So, oh, this is good. Right, I want to thank everybody who's been on. We all know who each other are. Remember, there's a website where everything goes on. And that's really the best way to keep up with what we're doing. I'm going to post the link in as our last act of the day. You'll see this stuff go up there. It might be edited to look a lot nicer because we've got an intern who does the video editing at the moment. So that's brilliant. Thank you all for coming. Thanks, Paul and Sarah, especially for joining us, and everyone in the audience. And we might see you in about a month when we run something next. We haven't decided what yet. Bye all.